Hey, this is John. Let's Talk Native is now on Patreon. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. We will be producing exclusive content for our Patreon supporters. Thanks for checking us out.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, and thank you for joining us. I've got a good show planned today. You know, a lot of times we talk about certain issues, and then those conversations breed more conversations. So, what we're going to talk about today is land back, and kind of let's call it land back options. How do we go about this? And the reason I want to have this conversation is one of my friends and a previous guest, Paul Winnie, reached out to me because he listened to the show that we talked about, where we talked about land back and that movement being something that, you know, clearly involves, you know, the Dakota and Lakota out and that were protesting at Mount Rushmore when Trump went out there. You know, land back lane. You know, there's this. It's a movement that has been going on for a while, and it begs the question, how do we go about this? What are the options? What are some of the ways that we can go about reacquiring lost land? And there are some things that are put in place, but then there's also some ways that have been done that are probably a little bit outside, you know, what people think of as a normal process, if there is such a thing. So let me go ahead and I want to introduce Paul Winnie. I want to thank you, Paul, for coming back and joining me on the program.
Oh, it's Dano. Good to be here.
Well, some of you may recall I had Paul on when we were talking about going out to Gowanus, Avon, New York, to protest the solar farm that they're trying to put there, and to make a statement. And Paul was the main organizer for that. And I got to say, you did a tremendous job. It was organized pretty well, especially, you know, considering we're in this pandemic, and there were so many obstacles that you had to overcome to do what you did. But you found yourself that after it was all done, and, you know, it was kind of a successful event, you found yourself, like many of us do, like, all right, now what? Those were your words.
Right.
So and again, I think it does beg the question: how do you confront in that situation? This solar farm is being built on what was a Seneca village, and a prominent Seneca village. So what would it take to reassert a presence back there? And that was one of the questions that you had for me. I mean, I don't know. Give me your thoughts as we start this conversation on where your mind has gone on some of this.
Yeah, I thought the rally was good for attention getting, but some of the things that I didn't speak about directly was that lands claim thing when I was talking to the papers and the TV people, and the emphasis that Canawagus was a 2 square mile reservation that was lost during the 1826 treaty of Buffalo Creek. So the lands claim of that non-ratified by Congress treaty was kind of like what I neglected to put on the front burner during that rally. But that's where I'm left with that. Like, how do we continue that argument to get that back?
Well,
And the other reservations down there, so to speak.
well, and you asked the question like, who does this? I mean, we get caught into this thing. Is it the nations? Is it the elected councils, the traditional councils? Is it the Confederacy? And what role do we play as as individuals in trying to further some of these causes? And I think there are options out there, and I think that's what I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit. Yeah, and to be clear, most of what people assert as treaties are very, very flawed. They're not just flawed because they were flat out broken, but they're flawed because the ratification process is suspect. And not only, I mean, it's very suspect on our side because did we ever have individuals according to our ways who were authorized to make these kinds of deals? I mean, did a chief or a Rayana, did they have the authority to make these kinds of deals? And I think there are many people who are quote unquote longhouse or Gallardo Goa followers who would say no, none of those things are legit because they all operated outside unless we assembled and those people who put their X on a deal had it gone through a legitimate process involving clans and three sides of the longhouse and all that other stuff. We could argue that none of it was legitimate. But the other thing is, as you were indicating, it's also not legitimate on the other side. They weren't properly ratified by the U.S. Either there are some of these so-called treaties that the state made that they simply didn't have any authority to make. And so what happens is you get federal treaties that they say, well, we're going to recognize the New York treaties. Well, if they weren't legitimate, how do you recognize something that was illegitimate in the first place? So there is not proper ratification oftentimes on either side. And I go right back to Canandaigua on this, and so from the very beginning of some of the treaties that were entered into or claimed to have been entered into, many of them are suspect. And even though we were always petitioned for these, we never asked for these treaties. These were always something that were imposed upon us as a means. In fact, in one of the Mohawk words that is used to describe a treaty loosely translates that we give up our land. I mean, because that's what all of these deals were. They were in some ways. Yeah, they were the acknowledgement or the recognition of set boundaries, but those boundaries were severely taken in. I mean, it was usually the major land cessions and some language that articulated what lands we were going to keep. So the treaty is very, very difficult, and there is no question that the legitimacy of the treaties, the actual language of some of these things. Look, there were not just treaties; there were leases that were sometimes as not just 99-year leases, but 999-year leases. On what, in what civilization, as they claim, would a 999-year lease be a legal instrument? I mean, these are some of the questions.
Well, there's a lot of ways to look at, like you're saying, I guess, but the question is that we need to move on these and get some action done, So
well, and again, part of the question is when we say we, who's we? And because one of the things that can be a real impediment is when people say, well, if you all get together and you make an agreement, then you got to have this like grand bargain on our side. And that sometimes is tough. I mean, and frankly, this idea of unity has been an obstacle because we have been so fractionalized and factionalized in our communities, and everything from the role the churches have played to, frankly, going back in some of the history, the alliances with the British or with the colonies, and all of these other, frankly, the Dutch, the French, the British, all of it, right? So. Right. It is these have been some of the things that have complicated. Now, when I look at things historically, there was almost no time in history that some of our individuals did not feel empowered to make certain moves. People always say, "Well, what side did the Revolutionary War did the Senecas fight on, or the Oneidas, or the Stockbridge, or any of?" And the reality is, there's this brush that gets painted that says that there was some sort of national alignment of our nations on one side or the other. And that was rarely the case. Usually there were pockets of Senecas that might have engaged in some of the white man's of conflicts. There were pockets of Oneidas, pockets of Mohawks. And part of that was based on their own relationships, intermarrying, some of the other things that bound them. It was rarely a ordained by council or grand council or nation council move to endorse or support one side or the other. In fact, you will find more often that the position of the nations were positions of neutrality, and it was individuals who made these decisions. And they may not have been prohibited from doing so, but it complicates the story. So I say all that because when we look at where we're at now, there are very few examples of land acquisition, from a Haudenosaunee standpoint. And we can point to a couple of them. Some of them, the Oneidas reasserted themselves on what was considered the 32-acre parcel, but that was not necessarily a land claim. That was something that got tied into court because of a white man who was trying to assert a legitimate title on the land, and the court said, "Wait a second, no, you didn't get this legitimately." So this wasn't even a land claim, but that 32-acre parcel in south of Oneida, New York, was something that was determined by a court because of a white man making a claim, and so spawned a resurgence of people, Oneida people, moving back to that one parcel of land and establishing themselves. The Cayugas have had some success in reasserting. Of course, they got muddled because of their conflicts, their internal conflicts. The Seneca Nation has what is they call the Land Acquisitions Clause, or what it is called the Land Acquisition Clause of the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act. That is a very streamlined process to reacquire lands that are in their Aboriginal territory, utilizing funds that were provided or given up by New York State and the federal government for what was considered an unfair lease of the city of Salamanca from the Allegheny territory of the Seneca Nation. So there's that. The other one that's out there is Gunyonge. Gunyonge is among the only examples of land that was taken back, that was taken through occupation, land that had not necessarily been recognized for a long period of time as native territories. And this was a group of Mohawks supported by people from other native territories who went into the Adirondacks and reclaimed what was essentially an old Girl Scouts camp, and they did an occupation that ultimately yielded a negotiation for moving to another parcel of land, which was kind of closer to Akwesasne and Ganawage, up near Plattsburgh, and that community of Gunyonge, and this started in the 70s, and here we are, almost 30 years later, and that community still exists. Now, those aren't the only ones, and you and I will talk about some of the other things that have transpired, but it kind of gives you an idea that yes, there are nation land claims. And then there are, kind of a little bit more of and I don't want to just call them a ragtag bunch, but a group that said, no, we've had enough and we're going to take some land back. And that's a little bit where we see things like, 1492 Land Back Lane up in Six Nations, some of the movement that as I mentioned, out of in the areas around Mount Rushmore and some of the Lakota territories, some of these territories that are slated for development or pipelines or mineral extraction. Native people are saying, no, we're taking it back. We're asserting our claim. So there are options, but I think maybe what we can do here is talk about some of the, maybe the upsides, the downsides, and kick around some ideas. And frankly, the best situation would be to have as many people unified and rallying around, a an effort to reclaim lands. But we know that doesn't necessarily work out that way sometimes.
Just trying to be a human bridge if I can in some of this. That's all I can try to reconnect, so we can do something. We have to reach across the aisle on our own behalf. And
Well,
I guess
yeah, I think so.
that's
Asserting, establishing some common ground and trying to reach. Again, I don't think we shouldn't go into this with the intent of being divisive. I think we should, try to speak to as many people as possible and try to get as much support when, in any of these situations. Because at the end of the day, the more support we have, the better. And unfortunately, until something becomes sensational, a newsworthy item, perhaps where violence or abuse takes place, sometimes it's hard to get people, engaged. And we should approach something like this not with the intent of having a physical conflict over it, but trying to make a legitimate case, and that includes internally, as far as us, the people who are trying to assert some of this claim, and the folks that may be opposed to it, non-native folks even. So, yeah, so I agree with you. I think we should try to have as much outreach and as much support as possible, but in the absence of it, I think we should figure out strategic ways of doing something that that may require less unity or less solidarity. So those are my thoughts.
Well, hopefully we can work some, at least get some ideas going.
Well, clearly one of the ways to acquire land is to just buy it. Buy the land outright, and of course that's an option. Of course, when you do such a thing, what you've got is a parcel of land that is on tax rolls, and it is claimed by a township or a county or jurisdictional issues. And of course, some people say, well, how do you buy land that's really yours? Well, my friend Sugar Montour used to say, I didn't buy the land back. I just paid the white people to leave it. And I'm okay with that. That's that's a good way to view it. But there is the always the potential of buying land, and you can do a lot on a parcel of land depending on what the town codes are and that kind of stuff. There are some things that you can do. You can also do some things that perhaps bend those rules, or come right up to the edge of those rules. And once you're occupying a parcel of land, however you come to that to that acquisition, we can push the issue. There are gifts, there are wills, or what do they call it? Bequeathments? I mean, there are people who bequeath lands to native peoples, and there's been interest in doing that for a number of years. You may have gotten some of those calls over the years. I've had people say, well, what if I wanted to donate my old farm? And you know what? I know people who have done that, not necessarily to native people, but to not-for-profit organizations, 501c3s that establish, perhaps an ag cooperative and that kind of stuff. So there are ways of doing some of that things once you have made the acquisition by whichever, however it happens. There are lots of options that may not be, as, flagrantly, occupying and taking the land, from the state or the county or whatever else. There are ways of doing this that kind of stay this side of drawing that line, and I'm not opposed to that either. I think there are different strategies that could be employed depending on how we approach land. There are land trusts, not just feed-a trust and the federal government holding land in trust for native people as a part of that feed-a trust process. But there are state land trusts. There are educational trusts. There are any there are any number of ways that you can put land into a some sort of binding trust that will prevent it from being sold off, and there may be some stipulations you put on what that land will be used for, so it never gets exploited in the environmentally, let's say, or whatever else. So there are ways of creating an occupation, so to speak, that are not necessarily some armed takeover like Ganyonge was. And in fact, what I'll say about Ganyonge may have started with a bunch of people occupying lands and defending their right to be there, but that standoff that existed from Ganyonge ultimately turned into the state saying, "Well, we've got this other land. We would rather have you look at this land and take this in trade." So I heard some New York State politicians saying, "Well, that's like somebody stealing your car and then you trade them a Cadillac to get your Lincoln back or something like that," which is somebody who was not happy about, and that was Mario Cuomo, who was, I think, the lieutenant governor or state attorney general or something, I don't know, but he's the one who negotiated the trade for what is now Ganyonge from what was Moss Lake, the Moss Lake occupation, and now that land, and this is kind of an interesting play. That land is held, as far as the state is concerned, that land is held in trust as an educational trust, and they've reacquired and added to that land that they originally acquired by swapping out that land in Moss Lake for this land up near closer to Plattsburgh. And but the Mohawks, the Gunjagahaga people who were there saying, "Look, as far as we're concerned, this is our land. You can paper this however you've got to paper this." So there exists a land trust, a board of trustees that are not native, that are kind of the names on the documents. And again, there's two different views of how this land exists. There's the Mohawk view, and then there's the state's view. But the reality is the state has kind of yielded in many, to a large extent, towards the Mohawk view of that land, even though officially on paper it's still just land held in some sort of educational trust. So I put that out there so people understand there are creative ways of accomplishing. And to be clear, Ganyonge has a bingo hall. They've got a gas station. They have gaming revenue that comes in. They've done all kinds of development, everything from a golf course to to other retail. They have homes there. They don't get building permits. They accept no funding from the state. And in fact, when some issues were raised about jurisdictional issues, that was one of the judges, and I can't remember the judge's name, but one of the judges said, "So this community is existing in the absence of any state and federal funding. So why do we think we have the right to impose our will?" So it's again a strange scenario, because it doesn't fit the most of what people think is the mold for Native people reacquiring lost land. But I guess what I want to say is that it's a testament to what creativity can produce if you can have willing participants and sit down to a negotiating table, and even if what part of the agreement, like with Ganyonge, is the agreement to disagree on what the status of that land is. Mohawks say it's Mohawk land. The state says it's trust land. Well, that I guess that's a debate. One of the things that was always said about Ganyonge is everybody's still willing to sit at the table, even if they're only eating pizza and chicken wings. They're still willing to sit at the table. So, I mean, and I know this doesn't give concrete answers to like your question. I mean, and part of your question is what if Senecas wanted to go back to Gowanus? And I think that's where you're still, somewhat, trying to figure out an answer to that.
Yeah, it's a little different because we're separated by space. 40 minutes away from Tonawanda. It's not like you can occupy, as in land back 1492, something that's right there.
Yeah, the edge of your territory. Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a little different situation, but. trying to get to something that's at Tonawanda, which is the stamp plant, which is we spoke before. That's the Science and Technology Advanced Manufacturing Park,
Mm-hmm.
which is on the eastern border of Tonawanda. So that's right up against our boundary. So if we were to occupy that land, because that coincides with the 1826 Treaty of Canawagas is involved with, along with the other Genesee territories, except for Little Beardstown, which was ratified in 1803. So that's where I'm at from here, trying to connect the two with the land back, if you would,
Mm-hmm.
concept. But then it also comes in a matter of time, action, because you've talked before that, this historical erasure is taking place, because if something like that happens, we can't come back with a landscape later and grow or get that territory back, because there's an industrial park there. Or Canawagas, there's a solar farm there. So it's a matter of action, I guess, on these ideas, or coming together on something, because then it's going to be already there and established. So
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, courts, who, oftentimes end up being the final arbiter of of some of these claims of land title and that kind of stuff. They weigh all that stuff in. I mean, it isn't about whether land was legitimately ceded or sold or whatever else. As far as the courts are concerned, they consider the time factor, and they consider about how inconvenient it will be, and how disturbing it will be to the non-natives. Not to how disturbing, our life has become on native territory. That's not their consideration. So if you're going to try to take over something that's been developed, they're going to say, well, what that development? What's going to? What about all the money that was put into that? What about the solar farm that was built? So you're right. If we don't, strike before development happens on our territory, it doesn't matter how legitimate our claim is, because that's not the way the courts view this thing. I mean, they really do take a view on this thing. All right, well, so much time has elapsed and you haven't been there for you to make this claim now, even if it's, it has some legitimacy in terms of the fraud that was committed, when the land was lost. We've got to factor in how much of how disruptive this would be to white people. I mean, and I say white people, I just mean to Americans, I guess. So, hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break and we'll come back. But I want to talk more about this, because I think this is part of the strategy, I think, is to try to figure out how we approach not just expanding our borders, but looking at lands that were ancestral ours, like Gowanus. Even if it's 40 minutes away from the closest established territory, does that mean that we have to give up on it? I don't know. We'll take a break. This is John Kane. I've got Paul Winnie as my guest. We'll be right back after this.
Back then I used to drive off Mason. Those cops not used to the faces we got. They would run my plates and we stopped, but I just left work where I restocked. But they see my whip and they see pots on my outfit. They think treetop got a head full of steam like a teapot. Better do what he say or you get shot. Ooh, who are you? See you like red, must be a pop rule. If you went to work, why bring the crew? What you think, black folks don't carpool? Better would've been a crib if my shirt turned blue. Keep your hands on the wheel, sir, turn in two. I stopped this car cause you did too dark. You know that's a lie, that ain't true. It's cause I
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I do have a guest joining me. I've got Paul Winnie, who is Tonawanda Seneca. Paul was a major organizer in the protest rally, if you will, that addressed the solar farm that's being developed on ancestral Seneca lands. The what was the community of Gowanus. Or Gowanus, I'm sorry. I got to get this right. Look, the unfortunate part is, the land claims have not, in terms of going into court to sue for land back, has not gone very well. And even when you get some sort of ruling your way, it's rarely ever definitive. I mean, the Oneidas had a case back in the 90s, where a majority decision, it wasn't unanimous, and I think it was only like 5-4, so it was a thin majority ruling, acknowledged that the Oneidas had right to sue for title or damages from lands that were unlawfully ceded or taken, but that didn't solve anything. It didn't like grant the Oneidas land, and in fact, as the Oneida Nation acquired lands within that claim area, with the intent of taking it off the tax rolls, that still became a challenge in court. So even lands that were purchased in the open market, where nobody is being dispossessed of lands, it becomes a challenge when a town says, well, we don't agree that the land can come off the tax rolls, or even in a situation where a trust is established, or a land purchase that is still essentially a state or county deed. It gives the opportunity for the non-native governing system around there, or that claims authority, to say we don't agree with the land use or the or what's happening there. So you asked me during the break, we ultimately end up in a court. Well, I think there is a difference between us going into court expecting the court to rule in our favor, because essentially what we're saying is we are going to give the court the authority to make a ruling about our legitimacy on a piece of land. And so when we go in as a willing participant or as a plaintiff in a case, we are essentially by implying that we are prepared to accept the outcome of that court. Yeah, there's appeals and that kind of stuff, but if we get brought into court as a defendant, and part of our defense is the illegitimacy of a land, the land transfer that where we lost our right to be on that land. I think it's a little different. I always say that it's one thing to be dragged into the court. It's another thing, to pray that the court will give you satisfaction. But this is tough. So this is where we come to, right? We come to this place where we got to figure out, how do we either avoid the showdown, or how do we prepare ourselves that if we are being sued, that we can defend ourselves adequately and change the status by being challenged, not by actually doing the challenging.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about before too that what I was concerned was the boiling down to a doctrine of discovery trump card, as in the Sherrill case, that we can't overturn that, but we have to be prepared in an argument to try to get around that somehow. That's
well, in all of these legal
in
all of these legal proceedings, what happens is people cite cases and they try to assert precedents on why a court should rule a certain way, or and of course the part of the danger is that by being in court and accepting the court's jurisdiction over a case, you are already operating within the constitutional confines of the United States, which this is where it's always difficult for those of us who may feel like we are not bound by the U.S. Constitution. So that's a challenge. But again, getting back to defending ourselves, one of the things, and you mentioned the Sherrill case, the city of Sherrill versus the United Nation. In this situation, the United had purchased lands, and then they established a couple of gas stations and C-stores, and they essentially stopped paying taxes on the land. And the Supreme, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, and I think it was near unanimous. It might have been 7-1, but it was near unanimous.
8-1.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. And the opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was again, liberal darling of the court at the time, recently passed away. By many accounts, considered a champion of civil rights and that kind of thing. But she wrote the opinion as well. And when you read the opinion and you realize what she and the court, and not just her by herself, but what the court was utilizing as the precedents for ruling against the Oneidas, it doesn't take a real legal genius to realize that they were wrong. And I'll explain the two legal doctrines that they cited as the reason for ruling against the Oneidas. One was called laches, which is sorry you waited too long. No, I take it back. There's three. One's called laches, which is sorry you waited too long. The other one's called the doctrine of acquiescence, means that your silence for this period of time suggests that that you were silent for too long. And then the third is called the doctrine of impossibility. Now, the doctrine of impossibility cites a case out in Lakota territory, the Yankton Sioux territory, I think, where they said once land has been lost jurisdictionally, once another jurisdiction, a state or county jurisdiction or township, has asserted jurisdiction over land, Native people cannot reclaim that jurisdiction. So, and that was considered the doctrine of impossibility. So she cites, cases to support laches, acquiescence, and impossibility. Now, to be clear, we couldn't be heard in court. We were not considered legally. We didn't have the legal standing to be in court. You mentioned in our conversations the Indian Land Claims Commission, and this was a way to try for the United States to try to solve land claims issues without ever giving us a day in court. They had a process, but it wasn't court. So we couldn't even be heard in court. We had no standing to be in court. Part of the reason we lost many lands due to leases, especially these 99-year leases and these 999-year leases, is because when the people who were leasing the land stopped paying, we had no recourse. We couldn't take them into court because we had no standing in those courts. So when I hear things like laches and acquiescence used, that is just terrible. I mean, and it's false. Because you can't claim that somebody waited too long if we never had the opportunity. But at the time the courts finally started hearing land claims, we were there. We were making those cases. The Oneidas were making those cases. So when I hear that stuff, it is just so weak. And the doctrine of impossibility, like I said, for Ruth Bader Ginsburg to cite the doctrine of possibility, you citing cases from Yankton Sioux territory, 1,300 miles away, and frankly, what was essentially 80 years earlier, and not acknowledge that in Seneca territory in 1990, now her ruling came in 2005, but in 1990, an act of Congress acknowledged that the Senecas could reacquire lost lands and they could assert jurisdiction. So a case only a couple hundred miles down the road, only 15 years prior, clearly suggested that there was no doctrine of impossibility, that there was possibilities for Native people to reacquire lost land and assert jurisdiction on that land. So her ruling was wrong. And shame on the Oneida legal team, whatever they were, for not driving home the Salamanca Lease Settlement Act and the Land Acquisitions Clause, because it could have destroyed the argument against the doctrine of impossibility. I mean, a lower court had ruled that was not a legal doctrine because no people were being displaced. But again, as you've mentioned in our conversations, this is another example of Ruth Bader Ginsburg still talking about just how inconvenienced the non-Native people would be, how disruptive it would be to the town, how disruptive it would be to the county, how disruptive it would be to the state. So it was, again, there is a disproportionate, or I'll say it, there's a racist view on who can be inconvenienced and who can't be inconvenienced. So I think this is an example where, when we get into court, we should have all our ducks in a row, because I think the Oneidas missed an opportunity. But having said that, I don't know that the opportunity still isn't there to challenge not just that, but even her footnote mention of the doctrine of discovery, something that we still have not pressed the issue with. Although I will say that the Yakima case involving fuel delivery from native territory to native territory, the Yakima Nation submitted an amicus brief to an individual who was being sued, and half of that brief was bound on the treaties that the Yakima Nation had with the United States. The other half was challenging the whole premise of the doctrine of discovery. Among the first times that I've seen where a nation has been willing to challenge the doctrine of discovery in court.
Well, I'd be willing to challenge it too, but when you talk about inconvenience, but I'm sure there was inconvenience when they decided to put a casino in downtown Buffalo for somebody.
Yep, and obviously that was challenged, and the challenge was lost. But I guess was it more of an inconvenience than the Pagulos building a bunch of ice skating rinks? I don't know, but so I guess you could argue that. But and that is part of what I would say is a legitimate debate. Of course, once the Senecas reacquired that land, frankly, the non-native view on it became moot. I mean, once that was Seneca land, and basically what's unique about the Seneca's land acquisition clause is that land doesn't become trust land. That land reverts back to original title, so it's Seneca land. And I think this is one of those areas that people don't realize, that there are varying degrees of status, I guess, land status. There's trust land. There's, as I mentioned, there's buying land and holding it in, state or county deeds. There's trust land that at the state level. There's trust land at the federal level. Then there's original title. There's not a whole lot of places where there's original title. And Native people that are surrounded by New York State, we do live predominantly with the advantage of having that land recognized distinctly as native lands, and there's some ripples in that, but it is kind of a unique status that we hold, most of our lands in. And that's always being challenged because, frankly, there are the Cayugas, some of the Cayugas are entertaining trust land. The Oneidas, as they've resolved this dispute over the Ruth Bader Ginsburg opinion and that ruling, have worked out other arrangements with the state and the federal government to have some of the land that they've acquired be put in and held in trust. Something that is not something that we have done much of, and so it changes our arguments and our status about that land status to some degree.
Yeah, the factor of them always going to be wanting to encroach upon us leaves us I see no other choice but to counteract that by doing something about it in present day.
Well, and they encroach both physically and jurisdictionally. So that encroachment has a couple of different factors to it too. But you're right. I mean, as we try to figure out how we are going to sustain ourselves, oftentimes with a growing population, or with other opportunities that may require more land acquisition, it is on us to try to do something to counteract the encroachment of not just the physical encroachment, but the jurisdictional encroachment on our territories.
And cultural.
Yeah, well, and cultural, absolutely. I mean, I still sometimes question how is it that native territories that oftentimes are struggling to have lands available for homes and and various other projects still have so many churches on their lands. So that that's a perfect example of a cultural encroachment that exists on our territories.
Yeah, I think we need to understand that both native and non-native of the real history that's behind all of this. Land acquisition and such.
And history is an important part of understanding that history gives us a lot more guidance to how we're going to deal with this stuff in the future. I will say that, look, I think we are at a better place from an education standpoint, and I don't mean law degrees and that kind of stuff, but just our awareness of what took place. Oftentimes when I talk about there being this breakthrough, I cite what's happening in Hawaii, because for generations the Hawaiians just accepted that the Hawaiian kingdom was annexed by the United States. Then they've learned in this last couple of generations that there was a lot of illegal occupation involved, and that there was no annexation treaty. So for us, it's just like with them kind of renewing their opposition to occupation. I think the more that we learn about what had actually transpired. I mean, look, there's been so many fraudulent land deals that were done, and understanding that fraud isn't necessarily about creating a legal case, against a county or a town or individuals. It's about understanding that when push comes to shove, that we can make an argument that when anybody else tries to claim that land is legitimately theirs, that we can make an argument that they can't prove it either.
Yeah, I've kind of been having to do all this homework ever since June, like I stated, as far as us getting involved with the solar thing on the Genesee Valley and Seneca and Iroquois lands and treaties and stuff. And I'm just sort of catching up, like I'm just now getting the Helen Hunt Jackson book on Century of Dishonor, which is from the 1880s, writing about all the government bad deals with the Indian tribes. So,
and a lot of that stuff,
reporting on, their mistreatment of us.
Well, and a lot of that, a lot of our research, the research that you're doing, and some of the stuff that I've done, gives you insight about the intent. And how, even as they made agreements with us, they made them knowing that they were going to break them. I mean, so they entered into these agreements. I go back to, guys like Thomas Jefferson and William Henry Harrison, when he was the governor of Indiana Territory and Jefferson was the president, where Jefferson is literally telling Harrison, it is important that we cultivate their love. We've got to convince them that anything that we're doing is out of the goodness of our hearts, even though what we're going to do is we're going to run them into debt, and we're going to try to get them to lop off that debt with their land. The level of deceit that went in, even into treaty making and into any of these land deals. I mean, look, somebody enters into a 999-year lease. Do you think they really plan on paying that? Of course they didn't. And I'm sure they were advised by legal counsel to some extent to say, look, once you're in there, they're not going to get, those Indians aren't going to get you off of there. I mean, I'm sure that was the attitude that they had, that once they got in and established a presence on our land, it didn't matter if there was if they were only there on a lease. So this is the level of deceit that took place, and of course, the other thing that's hidden in all this stuff is some of the deceit that existed amongst our own ranks. We had leadership that were making bad deals, and sometimes they were getting paid, on the side themselves. And so there's a lot of ugliness in this history, and most of it gives a pretty good indication that there was a lot of illegitimate land dealings that were done where Native people were the victims of the loss here.
Yeah, it's a time trauma thing that we just still live with. Well, generational thing that we I'm just saying we need to flip the page and take a stand on stuff.
Well, and like I said, I think there are various options, but you're right when you talk about the trauma. The hard part is, man, we travel through some of these lands, and they're still using the names that we called the places. They're using the names that we called the rivers or the lakes or the areas. They put their historical markers up, and so we're driving down the road and we see this blue sign that's going to tell us that we once were there, and so there's like a constant reminder, and these markers somehow make it seem like it was legitimate when it wasn't. So you're right. This is trauma that we're experiencing every time we assess the loss of our lands and the communities. And and I think it, for those who may forget, the very words that we call ourselves are connected to the land. So when we say, Onondaga, we're talking about the people of those hills. So it's the land. It's the Onyotaga, the people of the Standing Stones, or the Ganyagahaga, the people of the land of Flint. The land is integral to our being and to our identity. And and this is what's so tough, because during those removal years when we were being pushed from region to region, and so many native peoples were literally shoved off of an entirety off of their ancestral lands. I mean, it's really unfortunate. I mean, I think about the Mohawks, the Gunjagahaga. We only now see a slight presence back in the Mohawk Valley. There's a couple of efforts that are going on there, but and so this is the challenge, right? This is the challenge for us to figure out how do we, how do we land back? How do we approach trying to get some of our lands returned?
I think back to that original thing is, that's where our medicines come from.
There
That
you go.
we need to reestablish that territories, just for our own sake, that to reestablish our connection with the birth of the Senecas, whether it's Bear Hill or any of that area down there.
Well, yeah, and in our, people use this expression, as long as they say the rivers flow and the grass grows and that kind of stuff, and that this will be the treaty, right? This has been language, but it's not river flows. The way it was taught to me is that we talk about as long as the water flows. And that water isn't just rivers; it's the water of childbirth. So when you talk about lands where Senecas or Oneidas or Mohawks were born, you think about how much water passed through our women even in childbirth to those lands. And so it isn't just about our blood in those lands. It's the water of new life that has flowed. So, and without getting too spiritual, this is tangible. This is really a physical thing that connects us to the land, because the water of our mothers flowed with every birth into that soil.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm calling I mean, in lines of spirituality, is that the people need to create this energy to move in that direction, so that the thought process actually will happen eventually down the road, if we can come together.
Well, and again, I think some of the research that you've done and others have done, I think, is important. I think first we have to believe we have a case. And I don't mean a legal case. I mean that we have a legitimate argument for reasserting our presence in some of these lands. And I think once we understand just how wronged we were, and that really that we have to take it on ourselves, that the only way to right the wrong is land back. It is the idea of reclaiming and reasserting, even if it's small pockets of people in various places. I think we should work to be, to scatter as many small groups, villages, if you will, across all of our ancestral lands. And one of the things that I'll say this as we close out the show here, I always, as I saw New York State and other places struggling economically, and we're going to see more of that coming soon now with in the wake of this COVID-19. And I'm not trying to be necessarily opportunistic, but I know when they went through the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, I had hoped, as states became more austere in their budgeting, that the willingness for the state to give up state lands or maybe even parks would have been something that we could have considered. So, who knows? We don't know what opportunities the future holds for us, but I think doing the work that you're doing, which is really, really notable, and I think is an important step to where we need to go.
Well, I can tell you that I was in a little quandary of where I could go with the land back idea, because of the bad history that I was reading. And then when we talked, but I believe there's got to be a way that we can think this out, and give and take whatever it takes to create a seventh generation ideal. I think that some of these things are more than a generation, that you and I might not see some stuff, but we need to. It takes such a long time that that it can have enough momentum to go into the next generation for your grandchild to pick up the piece and then keep it moving.
Well, and you make a great point, because there are minds that are going to be better than ours in the future. That may be better equipped to make decisions and use judgment. So I think we should do everything we can to keep it alive and to create something that that somebody can take a little farther each time. I don't. We should never give up. We should never give up.
I've spent time listening to a lot of elders during my life, and I'm just a follow-up sequence to them.
There you go.
From 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s till now. So.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for joining me again. Great show, great conversation. We're going to keep it going. I'd love to have you back. I think this is a conversation that we need to continue to have. And as things become, apparent to us, I think we should share them. And hopefully, this show will inspire some other folks to do more as we go forward. So thanks again for joining me. And I want to thank you for listening and joining us here on Let's Talk Native. We'll see you next time.
How you gon' lie when you look me in my eyes and you show me a facade? Show me a facade. How you gon' lie when you look me in my eyes and you show me a facade? Show me a facade. You a lie. You a front. You say anything long as you get what you want. Tryna play me like a fool. Homie, I am not a clown. It ain't nothing but a game, cause all you do is mess around. Now I'm on the verge of a meltdown. Meltdown. Meltdown.